When we started this investigation, NXIVM was thriving. They have their main center in Albany, but they had centers in Mexico and LA and Vancouver. They had tons of students, enrollment was full, they had all kinds of workshops happening, and over the course of the investigation, we have watched this organization unravel. Keith Raniere does not immediately look like the kind of person who you would associate as a sort of bigger than life. You see a photo of him and it's sort of hard to imagine how he could hold a room and be this big charismatic figure. But the story we heard again and again is that he has an ability to make you feel like you're the only person in the room. He has an ability to listen really intently. And that was one of the strong draws for people who had come to him for their personal development, for their personal growth. You felt like this guy got you. You felt like he was able to help you. You felt like he saw you in a way that most people couldn't see you. So I think that was really at the center of his charisma and his charm. What's really interesting that when we started digging into who he was and sort of where he came from, there's a number of signs and characteristics that go right back to his teenage years and into his early 20s that are very much central to what NXIVM is. I spoke to one of his ex-girlfriends who said, you know, he had this idea that when he was 13 years old, he was enlightened. That he had reached some higher state of being. And that is really, you know, the image of himself that he continued to espouse as the head of NXIVM. So it's not only this idea of being enlightened, but also of being a genius. And he has kind of created this mythology around himself that he was talking in full sentences at age 1 and could read at age 2 and was a piano prodigy and a judo champion. In 1989, he takes this high IQ test and he does really well. And the Guinness Book of World Records lists him as one of the smartest men in the world. So there actually is some institutional acknowledgement and legitimacy to his claims that he is exceptional. That mythology he's built around himself, or the story he's built around himself of being a genius, of being enlightened, was central. A lot of people told us that's what attracted them to join this organization, to follow this guy. The other element that goes right back to his 20s is he had this particular infatuation with multi-level marketing structure, a kind of pyramid structure to how organizations run. And that's where members in the organization earn money by recruiting other members. He had worked for a while for Amway and seems to have been inspired by what he saw there. And then early on, before he created NXIVM, he actually created a multi-level marketing company of his own where he sold, you know, household appliances and vacation packages, and it did really well. And it was based on this same model. So when he created NXIVM, we see it again, that's how the organization was structured, that members of NXIVM went out and recruited other people and they earned commissions. It was one of the ways the organization could really grow. And then in fact, when DOS was created, and the FBI alleges that Keith created DOS, it has the same structure. Women were recruited into the group, and they were required to recruit other women. And you very quickly are able to sort of exponentially expand the size of that organization. And then the last element that I was totally surprised to see also stretches back almost to his teenage years, is his view of women and his view of sexual relationships with women. And there's a really a strong misogynistic undertone to NXIVM, that people are taught about these inherent differences between men and women. And one of those elements is that men are naturally polyamorous. They need to have multiple partners, and women are naturally monogamous. And going back to his 20s, he already had relationships, polyamorous relationships with a number of women who were solely devoted to him and were okay with him having multiple partners. And the FBI alleges that in NXIVM, he had 15 to 20 women in a so-called harem who had committed to him for life, committed to be in, only to have sex with him and to keep that relationship secret and to be okay with him having relationships with multiple women. And so in 1998, Keith Raniere and Nancy Salzman created NXIVM. The story we've heard is they had this epic 4-day meeting. Nancy Salzman was this expert therapist in neuro-linguistic programming. They have this meeting, it's the meeting of these two minds, and they create what is now called NXIVM. Within it, Keith Raniere is going to be the spiritual leader of it, the kind of resident philosopher, and he is called Vanguard. Nancy Salzman is called Prefect. And he really takes on this role as the spiritual leader, as the resident philosopher within the organization. He becomes a renunciate, which means he renounces all his connections to material goods. He doesn't own a car. He doesn't. He claimed in one interview that he doesn't even know the shirt he's going to wear every morning. That's sort of just given to him as a donation from the community. He is driven around by other members of his inner circle. He sleeps most of the day, apparently, and is up late into the night, and that's when he writes a lot of the curriculum. He has this vision that he wants to become someone who's seen as an ethical leader, an advisor to world leaders, but he actually exists in this very small kind of triangle within Albany, New York, or just outside of Albany, New York, just a few kilometers between his house, where he lives in this small community. There's a volleyball court a couple kilometers away where he plays every Tuesdays and Thursdays, and members of NXIVM are encouraged to come there, and it's a time that they can interact with him, and between points or between games, they can come up to him and whisper in his ear and ask him questions. So there's this interesting tension between someone who wanted to be seen as this kind of worldly figure, but then just existed in this small little circle. And he actually, we've heard from people we talk to, that once you climb up the ladder of the organization, once you get more involved in the organization, there is a lot of pressure for you to move to Albany, to be closer to the center of it, and to come sort of be in his orbit more directly. So Keith's public image is really based on this narrative, this mythology he built around himself as being a genius, as being enlightened, and being a highly ethical person. And that's the public image that he wanted to portray. And I would say that one of the biggest successes he had in giving this kind of image legitimacy was the Dalai Lama came in 2009 on an invitation from the group to come speak in Albany. And this was a huge success for the organization. And he really played this up as one of the reasons that you should come try out his workshops, try out his programs, follow this guy, because he had developed, he had turned his attention, his brilliant mind, to creating a personal growth system and a humanitarian system that was going to change the world. As you got closer to the center of this organization, you kind of peeled back the layers of the onion, people started to become privy to another side of Keith. First of all, he had this harem of 15 to 20 women. Many of them were high-ranking people within the company. Some of them sat on the executive board of the company. This was not something that was shared. People didn't know that. Some people I talked to said, "Oh, I thought he was celibate." He also had a public image that was really about rational and critical thought, and he was wanted to be seen as a scientist. But within a smaller private realm of these higher ranks, he had pretty unscientific ideas. One of those ideas, in fact, was that the people in the organization were reincarnated from Nazi officers. They've now, come back to atone for their sins and to redeem their souls, and it was one of the ways to better the world. So this was something that he definitely knew he had to keep private. It did not square with this sort of rational, scientific side of himself that he was trying to promote to most of the community. Keith Raniere's lawyers specifically say DOS was created by a group of women in the organization as a self-empowerment, a kind of separate, secret self-empowerment group by women for women. That everyone was part of it, was so consensually. They knew they were getting into. They were consenting adults. The FBI has a different story about what happened. Their claim is that DOS was created by Keith Raniere, and that he set up a kind of pyramid scheme that he was at the top of. And so he recruited, in the system, he recruited 6 slaves And he instructed them to go out and recruit 6 slaves, each of their own, and it would branch out that way. The FBI alleges that he used that system to instruct women within DOS to sleep with him. The allegation is that he used this system to get women within DOS to do work for free for the organization. And so if Keith Raniere is at the top of this, it's a very interesting question to ask, why would he create this? What is he up to? What is he doing here? People have pointed to a history of controlling women, a history of misogyny as well, and that this was the ultimate manifestation of his control over people and of women specifically. It'll be interesting to see what the prosecution says was behind the creation of DOS. They've certainly already uncovered and exposed some of the communication that he was having with women in DOS around the time that it was created. And that communication points to his interest in having women available to him as his sex slave. So the FBI has named Allison Mack as a co-conspirator. She has been charged with sex trafficking conspiracy, and racketeering conspiracy, amongst a number of other charges. So she has been implicated in potentially the creation and certainly the running of DOS. If this is true, it does seem to follow a pattern of Keith working with women to create projects. There's dozens of projects within NXIVM that are created as a kind of collaboration. Like, he seems to be more of the ideas guy, but then he has someone else he partners with to actually, enact these things. So the FBI allegation is that Allison Mack is the co-conspirator on this project, that she was one of Keith Raniere's slaves, and that she herself recruited other slaves to be part of DOS. And there are allegations that some of these women within the system were instructed by their masters to seduce Keith or to have sex with Keith. So I can say that Allison Mack is someone who is part of the smaller community, the kind of inner circle of NXIVM. She lived in Knox Woods, in this little neighborhood. In fact, she seems to have left her acting career to be a part of NXIVM and to really focus on her work in NXIVM. So if you look at the organization in terms of how they could use the tools to manipulate people, one of the things they did was to say, you need to ignore your gut instinct. You need to ignore the part of your mind that's saying this is not good, because that's what's holding you back in your life. But what that does is it takes away your critical thought. So when you're being asked to do something that is uncomfortable and that you don't want to do, or if you start to question what's going on here, and you have questions about Keith Raniere, you have questions about where the money is going, there's another part of your brain that starts to kick in and say, oh no, this is my issue. I always question everything. That's what's holding me back in terms of my personal growth. And that's one of the reasons why, when we heard stories of women, specifically the story of Sarah Edmondson, about being branded and going through this branding ceremony with a cauterizing pen. So it was a 45-minute ceremony that was incredibly painful. When I asked her, why didn't you just leave? She said, well, for years I've been part of this organization that had taken away that gut instinct. Every time that little voice popped up that said, this is not okay, I should get out of here, and she had been trained to ignore it. She had been trained to push past that. And so the things that at one point were seen as this system, this attractive system to kind of improve yourself in the world, can be flipped around and turned on its head and can be used to manipulate people as well. So we spent a long time trying to find someone inside NXIVM who would speak with us, and eventually we landed an interview with Keith Raniere's lawyer, Mark Agnifilo, and he has a very different take on Keith Raniere's involvement in NXIVM and DOS.
Everyone here is not only an adult, they're well-to-do adults. They're adults that, for the most part, are educated, they're smart, they have financial opportunity, they're successful economically, and they have choices. These are not poor, put-upon people, who are desperate for a better life and will make choices against their self-interest. I think the government's position has elements of sexism in it. There are men in the United States who join fraternities and get branded. A lot of them are athletes. We see these tremendous brands on their, muscular arms when they're during football games and during other sporting activities, and we don't think anything of the fact that big, strong, athletic men brand themselves. Also, men join secret groups. The Masons are a secret group. There are scores of secret groups from Harvard and Yale and all these, elevated educational institutions, but it's men, so we don't think anything of it. Women want to be in a secret group and want to be branded, and all of a sudden we're very quick to say, oh, poor dears, they must be victims. Because no right-thinking, free-willed woman would ever want that for herself, and I think that's sexist. And I think the government is playing into a sexist agenda. Men do these things, we call them Marines. Women do these things, we call them victims.
The FBI says that Keith was using DOS to compel women to have sex with him. What does Keith say about that?
Absolutely 100% false. I mean, Keith has a unique sex life. He has had multiple partners his entire life. They know about each other, and they're okay with it. I think most of the time. Not all the time, most of the time. But he makes no bones about it. This is who he is. And women choose to be intimate with Keith or not with that knowledge.
The FBI alleges that there are, in fact, several women who were in DOS who said they were forced or compelled because of collateral, they had handed over collateral, to have some kind of sexual encounter with Keith. Are you suggesting that those women are lying?
Yes, I'm saying they're lying. If they're saying that they were coerced to have sex with Keith, I'm saying they're lying.
I think one of the really interesting questions that to ask, or one of the interesting pieces of his behavior to look at, is what kind of person would need the constant validation that he has built for himself within NXIVM. The way that manifests itself is that in every single NXIVM workshop you take, there's a photo of Keith Raniere on the wall, and a part of the course is that you thank Keith Raniere. And then every year there's a 12-day celebration for his birthday where people get up on stage and perform for him and wish him happy birthday and thank him. In fact, there's a huge element of NXIVM that's all about paying tribute, this idea of paying tribute and honoring people for the work they've done, and a lot of that is oriented towards thanking Keith Raniere. So it's an interesting question, what's going on with someone when they need that amount of constant validation? And one expert I spoke to said that, in his opinion, he sees that as a cover-up for a huge brokenness or absence that needs this kind of constant validation that he's okay and that he's worthwhile. And if he doesn't have that he would fall apart. So that's one theory about what's going on. It's hard to imagine that NXIVM could exist without him there and active. But who knows what will happen. It seems like he has a remarkable hold and sway over the inner circle and the core members of NXIVM. I guess it's a question is, can he maintain that sway and persuasion, and will his followers stick with him if he's in jail? Going way back to when media first started criticizing the organization, Keith Raniere talked a lot and baked into the curriculum a narrative about the organization being under attack. And it was a way of inoculating the members against criticism and against outside scrutiny. And the story was that when people come around who are radical thinkers, who have new ways of seeing the world, who are revolutionary, there's going to be pushback. There's going to be people that want to destroy them. There's going to be people that don't want to see those ideas flourish. And he points to Martin Luther King and other Nelson Mandela and other revolutionaries. So that was another way to say, don't be surprised when the media comes out with stories. Don't be surprised if the government comes after us, or the police or the FBI come after us. That's what happens to radical thinkers, to revolutionaries. To that extent, it wouldn't be surprising if the people who have remained committed to him are able to do so despite the evidence that might come out in a trial. They may still stay devoted to him, and they may still follow his orders or decide to run some kind of version of this. It's hard to imagine though, that it would have the broad appeal that NXIVM had prior to Keith Raniere's arrest. When NXIVM was operating, when the executive success programs were operating at full speed, they were going after and trying to attract the general public. They needed new recruits. Now, if you Google it, it's hard to imagine that many people would, sign up for a personal growth workshop from an organization that has, its first Google hit, leader of elected sex cult, has been imprisoned. So it doesn't seem like it can exist in the way that it existed before, where they're trying to recruit new students to take a program that's supposed to make them a better, more humanitarian, more ethical person in the world.